you only have one location to visit per route. 100% of the times the nearest location, so the rightmost picture of the previous slide, was best. But if you only had 2, 3, 4, a few extra picks per route, its performance drops rapidly. And the within aisle, so the first picture, picks up rapidly. So you see there is a big trade-off based on picklet size, which method to use. With free routing, yes. If you go back to the supermarket warehouse where you have fixed routing because of weight restrictions and so on, you might make a different choice. Oh, this is still the Q per order index that we did in the example just a few slides ago. This is the formal definition, volume versus pick frequency. All right. So that's storage assignment. So I guess we now know where to put products. Zoning, I will be very brief about zoning. There is not that much literature about, probably the nicest literature about zoning is bucket brigades, which actually tells you not to do zoning, or to do flexible zoning. So you might want to read some of the articles of John Bartholdi about bucket brigades in the context of order picking. Big issue when you have zones. So you split up your area into separate pieces, and you assign order pickers to each of those pieces, that you have to somehow first split off consumer orders into the different zones, and then afterwards you have to bring it all back. I have some pictures about that later in a different context. So order integrity is a very big issue, getting the consumer order back together before you ship it. So there must always be some reason for zoning, right? Too many order pickers, too many orders, different kind of products. If you just look at the math and just look at routing distance, zoning will be worse. Only if you look at all the aspects around it, it might pay off. All right, going to routing problems. That was more or less implicit in the storage assignment piece already. We already talked about one-way traffic and so on in the discussion. How do you determine the sequence of locations to visit? So you have a list of products, you need to retrieve, say, 4 products from the area. Which one do you visit first? Which one second, third, fourth, and so on? If you look into, or if you ask warehouse managers what they do, oh, it's close to optimal, usually is the answer, because most people by now know there's an issue with routing and their vendors say they have a very perfect system. If you go into the software or actually talk offline with one of the programmers of the software, they will tell you it's not as fancy as you thought it was. I still see lots of warehouses that just follow location numbers. And I think, no, this list is not based on location number, right? You would just go to aisle A first, A12, then A25, C, W, and that's routing. Just sequence by aisle and by number in the aisle. Once back to the grocery store, if you have weight restrictions or some other restrictions and you want a specific sequence, or for your department store, yes, then following numbers might be a good idea because you want this fixed sequence anyway. If products are kind of the same and it really doesn't matter in which sequence you pick them, there's a lot of opportunity here to do better. Oh, I told all of this already. There's one extra thing, which is sometimes hard to explain to mathematicians and other quantitative people like myself. There's actually 2 goals in routing. One is just to minimize travel distance. but the other one is the easy to understand. Just imagine an order picker and you give this really strange list. So you have this, let's go back like 10 or 15 years. You have a paper list with locations like I showed you here. What do you think an order picker with this paper list would do, seeing when it's at A12 that there's something to be done at A26? Well, if he's a new guy on the block, then he will probably just do what's on the list. But if he has done this for a while, he'll say, okay, I'm pretty close to A25. Let's get that one right now because I'm nearby anyway. Thus upsetting your optimization algorithm, which would actually, this might be shorter, right? Now, so we introduce terminals. And you only see picks one at a time. You think you've solved this, right? Well, I've seen pickers clicking through 2, 3, 4, 5 picks. See what's up on the next picks. Oh, there's one in this aisle too. Let's do that one now. So then terminals get introduced that force you to first scan the location, and only then you can see the next one. Well, depends on your vision. If you do that, you have achieved routing optimality, but you also have brought people more towards the domain of being almost machines. And well, some people don't respond too well on that. So there's a balance somewhere on how much you can turn people into robots and still be happy on their job. On the other hand, give them more freedom that sometimes might be less optimal. Hard to research, but a big issue in many places. So, okay, let's optimize by computer. Two basic options. If you go into an aisle, do you all the items on two sides of the aisle at the same time? So you go in once, pick products from left and right, or do you go up and down and pick on the left, then pick on the right on the way back? I've seen both. Usually if you see the one on the left, you can tell them up front, I'm going to reduce travel distance by 25 to 30% for you. Without calculations, you're probably doing all right, if it's possible. Because the left option, even though still used here and there, is not a good option. This was an article by Mark Goedschalks, if I remember correctly, and he showed that you really need some very extreme cases for this to work out. So typically, two-sided picking. Pick left and right of the aisle at the same time and don't go back to the same place. Okay, so we are going to use automated computerized routing methods, and we are going to do two-sided picking. Then still, we have a lot of decisions left. A lot of heuristics exist. And this is about the simplest and one that you will find in many warehouses. Might be called differently, might be called traversal, transversal, or any other variation. It works. It's better than following the location numbers, but it's not a really, really good method. So basically what it does, you start at the depot, you move from the depot to the right until you find the first aisle that has some work to do. If you find that aisle, you go in it. So actually that's the first aisle in this example. And you traverse to the end. So if there's just one pick here in the front, you will always traverse the aisle entirely. If you're at the back, then you start traveling to the right until you find the next aisle that has some work. In this case, it already is the second aisle, and you go back to the front, regardless of where the pick is. So once you go into an aisle, you traverse it through its entire length. Now you can already visualize the examples where this will not be a good idea, right? Suppose an order that has just a few picks in the front with one of the ABC methods that we had just before. So let's get an example that can actually cover that. This method will basically just walk around the outside, around the perimeter of the warehouse, and it just pops in and out of an aisle if there's something to be done. So there's a pick here, you go in and you go out on the same side. There's two variants of this. Actually, the easiest way is just to split up the warehouse in the middle, and everything that's in the front half you pick from the front, everything that's in the back you pick from the back. This one is a bit more advanced in the sense that you look for the biggest gap, largest gap method. You look for the biggest gap between two picks. So maybe here, this is a gap front to the first pick to the second pick is a gap, and the second pick to the back is a gap. And you look which gap is the biggest, which should actually, oh, there's one here, right. So this is a gap to the first pick, from first to the second, from the second to the third, and from the third to the back. Those are the 4 gaps that are in this aisle. And you do not traverse the biggest one, which is from the back, from the last pick to the back. That's the part that you do not visit. And that's slightly better than just splitting up the warehouse exactly through the middle. Yes?
But you're doing a U-turn inside the aisle. It might not be comfortable for the operator to see.
Yes. This is assuming that you can do this, right? If you go back to some of the pictures I showed, where I said this is my favorite configuration, that's the person with the cart and the shelf racks, then this is not a problem. If you have a huge truck that has like 3 or 4 pallets on it, it might drive just back and just go in reverse. Typically trucks like that like to just go forward, and then you would have to go to the first routing method. So there are always, as always in warehouse design, there's optimization and there's practical constraints, and you can only do the optimization within the practical constraints. So delete this one if it's not practical. Now this is not very nice if your picks are in the nearest location configuration, because this method will force you to go to the back and traverse along the back cross aisle. So the third method does a little bit of both. It basically selects per aisle whether you reverse it or make a turn. Disadvantage is there's just one turn. There's no option for 2 turns anymore in this method. So either you traverse or make 1 turn, but you do not ever revisit an aisle, which we did on the previous method, right? Here you see a lot of aisles where you go twice. That's not an option here. But you do have a choice, and actually this method uses a little bit of dynamic programming looking ahead 1 aisle. So it finds